there are certain kinds of books that a lot of people start, not because they have to, but because they feel like they should. They feel maybe internal pressure or external pressure. These are generally the big ones, the famous ones, the ones that everyone's always talking about. And I think often they're the same ones for all of us. And generally it follows a similar pattern, right? You pick up the book, you have great intentions, you know it's a classic, you want to read it, you want to get through, you get partway through, and then somehow, once again, you just didn't finish it. You never quite seem to be able to. So I went on a deep dive. I went through a bunch of reading lists on Goodreads and through your comments, and I found that these are the books that people often mention starting but struggling to finish. So the first one is Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. Now, this is one of those books I think people pick up for the ideas. Obviously, Ayn Rand wrote this as a sort of philosophical statement, so it's rich in philosophy and, you know, all of these musings about individualism and ambition and society and, the flaws of communism and socialism in general. Obviously, Ayn Rand came from the Soviet Union. She was very critical of that, and she founded her philosophy objectivism based on this. Now, a lot of people, I think, eh, struggle to get through this novel because it's not just a regular novel. It's like 1,200 pages long. It's dense. It's filled with extended speeches, a lot of pontificating. Sometimes for like, in the case of Galt's speech, it's almost like 50 pages of him just espousing his philosophy. So a lot of people start curious, but they end up getting stuck somewhere in the middle. And I think it feels like a drag for a lot of people. I read this novel. I'm actually a big fan of Ayn Rand. I think that her writing style a lot of times gets denigrated, but I actually think she's a very talented writer. It's what she's doing. It's just entertainment. It's well written. You can see the influence of Hugo for sure in her writing. She mentions him as one of her biggest influences. Um, but I think Atlas Shrugged is worth reading, although I do agree there are some tedious passages, and some of these long speeches could definitely have been cut down a little bit. A second one here, speaking of Hugo, Les Misérables. Now, this is one of my favorite novels of all time. Victor Hugo didn't just write a story with this novel. He created like a whole almost cinematic universe, a whole universe really, um, of love and struggle, rising above challenges. It's really one of the great testaments to the human experience. To love another person is to see the face of God, right? In the words of Hugo. I think it's really beautiful. Hugo was obviously notoriously quite arrogant as a writer as well. To be fair, some people maybe are good enough that they earn the right to be a little bit arrogant, but I think part of the challenge with this world is it's massive. Hugo also pauses at certain moments to just go super deep into history or politics, and he'll go on like a 50-page tangent about some war in the past. And so that I think is one of the things that people struggle with as well. You think you're reading this novel, and then all of a sudden you're on this tangent, and you're like, oh my goodness, this wasn't what I signed up for. Um, Tolstoy is also very notorious for doing that. So that's one of the reasons I think people struggle most with Les Miserables, but I think it's really worth reading. It's an incredible novel, and it requires patience. Um, I think that's where the momentum starts to slip for a lot of people. Number three here, this is really two in one, The Silmarillion and The Lord of the Rings. So The Lord of the Rings, I think, is one of the most common ones. On a lot of the lists that I read, it was number one or number two. And I think that's because everyone's heard of Lord of the Rings. They want to read it. Tolkien created one of the most detailed fictional worlds ever, right? And The Lord of the Rings is a commitment to read. But I think The Silmarillion is even further because this takes even more commitment. And I think for a lot of people, they want to read Lord of the Rings and they might not get through it. The Silmarillion, even fans of Tolkien want to read it and don't get through it. So this is one of the ones, it's a little more meta, but it's like the next stage, the book that a lot of Tolkien fans will say that they, have read, but they've only read a part of it, or they want to get through it and they just haven't been able to push through it because it reads almost like Tolkien was a philologist and also a great historian of ancient, particularly Norse mythology, and you can see that influence in this book, and it reads more like a mythology or an ancient history than just a typical story. So I think people go in expecting a different adventure, like The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, and when they find this really dense, history of Middle Earth, they're like, maybe this isn't what I was hoping for. So that's another one that people often don't finish. Next up, we have Tolstoy, Anna Karenina. Now, Tolstoy's known for writing about life of individuals. He famously loved peasants. He kind of was the classic example of the aristocrat who wanted to, who thought that peasants could do no wrong, and they were like the true, best element of humanity. Ironically, he was married to a woman who loved luxury, and so there's a lot of interesting biographical details about that. But we won't get bogged down with that. Anna Karenina and War and Peace are his most famous works, but Anna Karenina is it's a long work. It's filled with a lot of complex characters, relationships, ideas. It kind of moves slowly. I think that's why a lot of people get bogged down. It also depends on the translation that you pick. There's a lot of variability there, but it really requires patience. I think though you know, it's also one that it's really easy to put down and then never really return to it. I think that's part of the reason why people don't finish it. They say, "Oh, I'll pick that up again soon," but if you don't keep that momentum, it can be very difficult to get back into Anna Karenina because it's not a light read. So that's another one that I saw a lot, and that one I saw in some comments. I saw War and Peace as well in comments. Um, Next one is Crime and Punishment. Now, Dostoevsky definitely had the gift of psychologizing. Many have called him kind of like the proto-psychologist in a way. I think I kind of agree with that, although I do think that even earlier writers like Shakespeare really had this psychologizing of the human mind in a really interesting way. But Dostoevsky was certainly gifted as a with his insight into the human psyche. But the book is just intense, right? I mean, Brothers Karamazov's also like this, but Crime and Punishment, it's like this long story about a character who's struggling with guilt and anxiety and this deep inner conflict about an atrocity that he committed. And it's not just about crime and punishment in this world, but it's about like spiritual crime and punishment and how the human mind can be a prison of its own in a way. So it's not just about what happens, it's about the feeling of this novel. It's very dense, it's very intense too. And I think it's kind of hard with that weight. It's not a light novel. It's got a lot of weight to it. And I think that might be why a lot of people don't get through this one because they just feel like this is heavy. I don't know if I can commit to this anymore. Number six here is Don Quixote. Now, Cervantes probably can be attributed as the writer, the first novel. Um, Honestly, probably I'm going to amend that and say he wrote the first novel. I think it's pretty clear that there was no real contender for the first novel other than Don Quixote. Um, but it doesn't read quite like a modern book. It's a little bit archaic Spanish, which again means that when we're reading it in translation, which translation you pick is going to make it more or less enjoyable. I recommend the Edith Grossman translation for accessibility, and also it's a great translation. I might do a video in the future on translations in particular because I do think it matters the language we're talking about actually, like a Russian translation, the how honest that is to the original language is going to look very different than Spanish because Spanish and English are much closer together. So there's not going to be as much variability, but that's kind of a side point there. Typically speaking, if you are going to read this in translation, choose an easier translation because it can really bog down if you are reading an old, dense translation. Now, I think that there's a lot of great humor and pacing in this, and also the structure, the way he wrote it too. It's like you could just read a section of it, and it feels like the end of a novel. It feels like more like Don Quixote is sequels within the novel. That is actually how he wrote it. There was a large gap in time between when he wrote the first part and later parts. Um, but I think that's one of the reasons why it's different. It's just not how what we're used to. It's the first novel, but it's like Shakespeare was one of the first writers in modern English. It still feels a little bit archaic, I think, when you read it. Um, and even though it's really important, I think that unfamiliarity makes it hard to build momentum. Number seven here. We're on seven, right? Yeah, seven. Moby Dick. We talked about this one before. This is one that a lot of people in the comments said that they had tried, they'd started, and they loved, or they tried, they started, and they just felt like it was transcendental nonsense, or they said it was a 150 page book spread out over 600 pages. I saw a lot of different comments with different perspectives on Moby Dick, which was really interesting. But I think the thing is, it's part adventure novel, right? It's the story that you know, but it's just as much part philosophy. So yeah, you could argue that Moby Dick definitely feels like it meanders a little bit, but I don't actually think it does, in my opinion. I think that the transcendental philosophizing is actually really interesting. Um, could be pretentious. I saw one comment that said that. Yeah, you can make that argument. But I think that, the best argument for that is that Melville does kind of show off his knowledge of whales a little bit too much. You could argue that. But, it starts with that clear story. You're chasing the white whale, and then you're in all of these detailed sections about whaling. I think that's where a lot of readers check out, right? At that part where it's like, yeah, I don't know, I don't see where the story is. But it ends with a bang, So if you can get back into it and really finish it off, Moby Dick is absolutely worth the wait. And then the last one here is Dracula by Bram Stoker. So this is one that I saw in a number of mentions as well, and on a lot of the Goodreads lists. It was very high on the list as well. Because it's an epistolary novel, meaning that it's told through basically letters, although there's some newspaper clippings and other sections through in it. But basically, it's a bunch of letters back and forth, journals and whatnot, and documents that tell the story. And I think that that's a little bit of a different and maybe unfamiliar approach and way of doing it. And so I don't think it's particularly difficult to read, but because of that structure being a little unfamiliar, I think that can slow things down for a lot of people. It really builds atmosphere, but if you're expecting this constant action, it can be pretty hard to stay engaged. So, you know, all of these and some other books that come up, there's a bunch of other ones too. Uh, I saw a whole list, and I wrote a list down here actually. Let me find this. A list of other ones too in the reading lists and comments that people started and didn't finish. Some of these included Ulysses, Catch-22, War and Peace, The Brothers Karamazov, The Scarlet Letter, A Tale of Two Cities, 100 Years of Solitude, Gravity's Rainbow, Infinite Jest, The Catcher in the Rye, that was a big one, The Great Gatsby as well, The Aeneid, and I'll be honest, I'm definitely guilty with that. I didn't finish that one, even though I started it. Um, I don't think the point with books that we start and don't finish is that they're too hard. I think, they ask a lot from us, these books. They ask time and focus and patience. And I think sometimes we just pick them up at the wrong moment. You know, some of these books really need a very particular moment, a very particular mindset in order to prepare yourself for reading them. And because of that, the same book that you couldn't finish today, it might be one of the ones that you absolutely love and is your favorite book a few years from now. But that's all I got for today, guys. So I'm curious, what's a book that you've started but never finished? Put that down in the comments, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time. All right, thank you for tuning in. God bless.